The last time anyone saw Catherine Blackburn alive, she was sweeping her front porch. Saturday evening, Albany, New York, between 5 and 6 o'clock, same time she always did it, same broom, same porch, every week without exception. Kate Blackburn was born Catherine Beck in Albany in 1914, the daughter of Polish immigrants. She had one brother and 5 sisters. Their Catholic faith wasn't something this family discussed on Sunday mornings and then set aside. It shaped every choice they made, every relationship they entered, every door they opened, and every one they kept shut. For Kate, that faith was both armor and cage. In 1938, she married Jesse Blackburn at City Hall, a compromise she felt the moment she made it, because the church wouldn't recognize his previous marriage. Jesse was in the Army Air Corps, unreliable and always moving. Kate stayed behind in Albany, bound by vows that made divorce a sin. Jesse eventually settled in Japan. Kate stayed at 117 Colonie Street, wiring him money when he needed it, which was often, and building her life without him. She spent 30 years at the Mohawk Brush Company, rising from the factory floor to forewoman. She owned her 2-family house outright and rented the upstairs apartment for extra income. Every weekday morning, her friend Marie Hogan picked her up for the ride to work. Every Sunday at 6 a.m., she walked to St. Joseph's Roman Catholic Church without fail. Every Saturday evening, she swept that porch. Her neighbors could set their clocks by her. Earlier in 1964, her upstairs tenants moved out after a death in their family. Kate began advertising the apartment in the Knickerbocker newspaper in July. By September, she told people she had found someone. A short man, she said, looked to be in his 50s. He told her he'd be moving in October 1st, him and his elderly mother. He had paid a $10 deposit. But something about this man had been eating at Kate from the moment she met him. When he came to view the apartment, he smelled of alcohol. And the address he gave her, 369 2nd Avenue, was in a far wealthier part of Albany. Why would someone leave a nicer neighborhood to move into hers? It didn't fit. So on Wednesday, September 9th, 3 days before her death, she asked a friend to drive her there after dark to check it out. They found the street. They looked for number 369. It was too dark to make out the house numbers. They turned around and went home. 3 days later, she was dead. On Saturday the 12th, Kate worked her half-day at the factory and came home around noon. That evening, right on schedule, her neighbors watched her sweep the porch between 5 and 6 o'clock. Then she went inside. A little while later, she called one of her sisters. Her sister offered to bring food over for dinner. Kate said, no, a tenant was coming to see the apartment. That was the last time anyone heard her voice. Sunday came. Kate was not at the 6 a.m. Mass, not at the 8 a.m. Mass, no laundry on the line, no trash burning in the yard. Her neighbors noticed. Nobody knocked on the door. Monday morning, Marie pulled up at her usual time. Kate didn't come outside. Marie knocked. No answer. She called the family. A niece arrived with Kate's sister Anna. They tried the front door. Nothing. They tried the windows. Nothing. Then they found the cellar door unlocked. They went through the basement, climbed into the shared foyer, pushed open Kate's apartment door. The first floor was quiet and empty. Kate had mentioned she'd been painting the upstairs unit to get it ready for the new tenant. They climbed the stairs. The front door of the upstairs apartment was open. And there on the living room floor, Kate. They ran to call an ambulance. The paramedics arrived, and the first thing they did was not try to save her. They stepped back and called the police instead. The man who paid that $10 deposit had given Kate a name. He had given her an address. And as investigators were about to find out, neither one was real. Kate was not killed in the living room where her body was found. Blood evidence told investigators the real story. The attack started in the entryway between the upstairs kitchen and the back bedroom. She had brought the man up to show him the apartment. While she went back downstairs to get the keys from a lockbox in her bedroom, he took something from her kitchen, investigators believe a small hammer or meat tenderizer, and waited. He struck her from behind. The attack was sudden and devastating, leaving Kate completely incapacitated before she could even realize what was happening. She went down face first on the kitchen floor. The killer then retrieved a weapon from downstairs, returned to the scene, and ended Kate's life. It was a calculated act that left no chance of survival, changing the course of this investigation forever. What came next was not the behavior of a panicked man. He broke open Kate's Cedar Hope chest and pulled out a white linen sheet. He took 2 pillows from her bed. He moved her into the living room and attempted to alter the crime scene, trying to obscure the signs of the struggle. However, the scale of the scene was beyond his control, leaving behind traces that would later alert those below. Then he went back downstairs to her kitchen. Operating in the dark without electricity, the killer methodically used the available utilities downstairs to further compromise the scene and the victim. He spent considerable time ensuring no immediate clues remained, yet he unknowingly left behind critical biological evidence that would wait decades to speak. Before leaving, he crossed to the living room hutch and grabbed Kate's rent receipt book. He tore out the last written page and the 4 sheets beneath it, pulling out the permanent stubs along with them. He was methodically erasing every trace of his identity from the house, but he didn't account for indentation evidence. The pressure of Kate's handwriting had transferred onto the pages below, leaving behind faint, ghostly impressions. Forensic experts worked those pages carefully and recovered a first name with confidence: Robert. The surname was Harder, Broadhead, Brandhead, Boardhead, depending on which expert examined it. The address he had given Kate, 369 2nd Avenue. The exact location she had tried to verify herself 3 nights before she died. Police pursued every variation of that name across Albany. They checked the residence of 369 2nd Avenue. They checked every house numbered 369 on every other street in the city. They sent case information across multiple states. They traveled to Connecticut to interview a man who had called a woman advertising an apartment, telling her he wanted to rent it for himself and his mother. The exact same story the deposit man had told Kate. He turned out to be unconnected. Every single lead collapsed. The name was false. The address was a prop. The man had handed Kate a $10 deposit and a fake identity, and then walked out of her house and into thin air. Then investigators pulled Kate's phone records. One number kept appearing, a number that had called her roughly 10 times between Saturday and Monday with no answer. When they traced it, they found a man named Ben Maskin, a produce seller who had survived polio and now walked with difficulty. His alibi was solid. His grief was not performed. He was cleared quickly. But what he told police rewrote everything investigators thought they knew about Kate Blackburn. Ben and Kate had been together for 16 years. They met in 1948. Kate was still technically married to Jesse, and, under her faith, any involvement with another man was a sin. But so was divorce. She was trapped on both sides. There was another layer. Kate was Polish and Catholic. Ben was Jewish, and in 1960s Albany that gap still carried real weight. So Kate kept him completely invisible to her family. And yet she couldn't keep him entirely out of her world. When her niece worked at a Carvel ice cream stand, Kate and Ben would park far down the street, far enough that no one would connect them. Then Kate would send Ben up to the counter alone, just so he could meet her niece without anyone understanding why. He had come by the house Saturday night. No answer. Came back Sunday. Still nothing. He never saw her again. He found out what happened the same way strangers did, by reading it in the newspaper. He had loved Kate quietly for 16 years, and the man who killed her had made sure Ben would spend the rest of his life keeping that secret alone. The investigation ground forward and then stalled completely. The ghost with the fake name and the $10 deposit had vanished. Years passed. The detectives who worked Kate's case grew old. Some of them died, but in a storage room at the Albany Police Department, the evidence sat exactly where it had been placed in 1964. Every knife, every sheet, and a handkerchief recovered from underneath a dead woman's body, waiting for a technology that did not yet exist. Before the funeral flowers had wilted, Sandy and her cousin Teresa went back to 117 Colonie Street. They were barely 20 years old. Nobody sent them, nobody asked. They just knew that their mothers, Kate's sisters, could not walk into that apartment and see what was on that floor, so they went themselves. And they personally took on the heartbreaking task of restoring the apartment, ensuring their mothers wouldn't have to face the aftermath. That is the kind of heavy burden that stays with a person forever. More than 300 people packed St. Joseph's Church for Kate's funeral, forcing the Mohawk Brush Company to shut down for the day so her co-workers could attend. From across the street, detectives watched every face in the crowd. They had wired a hidden microphone inside Kate's casket, hoping the killer might lean in close to whisper a final word. He never came. Investigators reached as far as they could. They vetted Albert DeSalvo, the Boston Strangler, whose method of targeting women living alone in apartment buildings matched the details of Kate's murder closely enough to warrant serious attention. They examined Lemuel Smith, a convicted killer from nearby Amsterdam, New York, with a documented history of sexual assault and mutilation. Neither man could be tied to the scene. The receipt book name remained a phantom. The ghost had no face and no trail. Yet one detective refused to let the file settle. Lieutenant Edmund Ted Flint kept Kate's folder at the very top of his cold case stack for the rest of his career, working it long past retirement. He died without ever knowing who killed her. His name never made the headlines, but without that obsession, the evidence might not have survived what came next. Because of how seriously those original detectives had worked the case, the physical evidence endured. Decades before DNA testing existed, the 1964 investigators had worn gloves at the crime scene and bagged and labeled every item with extraordinary care. They had no idea what technology the future might bring. They just did the job right. Kate's house on Colonie Street was eventually demolished. The lot sat empty. But in a storage room at the Albany Police Department, those boxes remained exactly where they had been placed, untouched, intact, waiting. They had left a gift for the future without knowing if anyone would ever open it. In August 2018, someone finally did. Detective Melissa Morey was working in the Albany Police Department's Forensic Investigation Bureau when her husband came home from a gathering of the department's retired detectives. They had spent the evening talking about the cases that never fully let go. For most of the men in that room, when the conversation turned to the one case that still haunted them most, the answer was the same name every time: Kate Blackburn. Melissa pulled the file the next day. What she found stopped her. Everything from 1964 was still there. Every piece of evidence, intact, carefully preserved exactly as those original detectives had left it. And sitting at the top of the collection was a small cloth, the handkerchief recovered from underneath Kate's body 54 years earlier. Melissa began making inquiries about modern forensic testing. She identified potential labs, she started pushing doors open. Then she was promoted to a new division and had to step away from the case entirely. Another door closing. But the case wasn't done finding its way forward. That same November, Dr. Christina Lane launched a forensic genealogy program at the College of St. Rose in Albany, a center built around the specific idea that cold case victims deserve modern answers. And the woman who would connect it to Kate Blackburn was not a detective or a scientist. She was an elderly woman who had spent 60 years carrying the image of her aunt on that floor. She saw the news coverage of the program's launch on television, and she picked up the phone. What nobody knew yet, including Melissa Morey, was that this woman had been living on the same street as Melissa the entire time. Sandy Carmichael picked up the phone in November 2018 and called the College of St. Rose. She had seen the news coverage about Dr. Christina Lane's newly launched Cold Case Analysis Center, a program built around the idea that forensic genealogy could crack cases that traditional investigation never could. Sandy was in her 70s. She had been waiting 60 years for someone to tell her who killed her aunt. She decided to ask directly. The center contacted the Albany Police Department. Melissa Morey was assigned to lead the investigation. And then Melissa found out something that stopped her cold. The elderly woman who had been complimenting her dog on their neighborhood walks, the quiet neighbor she passed on the street without a second thought, was Sandy Carmichael, the teenager from that apartment floor in 1964, Kate Blackburn's niece, living right there on the same street the whole time. Melissa and Dr. Lane went to work. What followed was not a quick breakthrough. It was years of dead ends, rejected funding applications, and technologies that turned out to be wrong for the evidence. Cold case work does not move in straight lines. It moves in long stretches of nothing, broken by single moments that change everything. That moment came in 2023. A non-profit called Season of Justice provided a grant that made the testing financially possible. The Albany Police Department partnered with Othram Inc., a forensic DNA lab in Texas that specialized in extracting genetic material from aged and degraded evidence. The key piece was the handkerchief, the cloth found underneath Kate's body, preserved in that evidence room for nearly 6 decades. Othram used a sterile wet vacuum system to pull DNA from the porous surface of the fabric. From that material, they built a complete DNA profile using forensic-grade genome sequencing. That profile went to the FBI. The FBI's genetic genealogy team ran it against public genealogy databases, the same technique that identified the Golden State Killer. They didn't find the killer directly. He was already dead. But they found his relatives, people connected to him by blood who had submitted their own DNA to ancestry databases with no idea what that information would one day help solve. Investigators worked backward through the family trees until they arrived at one man, dead, since 1998. Never once a suspect in Kate's case. His surviving relatives were contacted. They cooperated fully and provided DNA samples for comparison. The results confirmed investigators were closing in. But confirmation from living relatives wasn't enough. They needed the man himself. September 15, 2025. 61 years and 1 day after Sandy had found her aunt on that apartment floor. Investigators arrived at Albany Rural Cemetery with a court order. They opened a grave, took samples from a femur and an arm bone, sent them to the lab. Weeks later, the results came back. It was a match. Joseph Stanley Nowakowski. He was 33 years old when he took Kate Blackburn's life. When investigators finally read his history against the crime scene, it revealed a calculated predator. Arrested at 18 for multiple burglaries, he was later caught at Union Station carrying a loaded pistol, switchblades, a crowbar, skeleton keys, handcuffs, glass cutters, and detailed floor plans of private residences across multiple cities, alongside newspaper clippings he had collected, tracking wealthy families leaving town on vacation. This was not opportunistic crime. This was a man who studied his targets and waited for the right moment. In 1973, 9 years after Kate's murder, a 74-year-old woman in Schenectady was attacked in her bed with a hatchet. Days later, Nowakowski crashed his car drunk. Inside the vehicle, police found the blood-stained weapon. A gold dental crown left at the scene matched his own teeth. A glove matched the crime scene. He pleaded guilty, served his sentence, was released in 1980, and died in 1998. For over 6 decades, his name never once appeared in Kate's file, until a pristine handkerchief proved otherwise. On October 8, 2025, Albany Police Chief Brendan Cox stood at a podium and finally read the name aloud. The room was full of people who had waited a very long time to hear it. Sandy Carmichael walked to the microphone. At 81 years old, she told the room that over 6 decades ago, evil had entered her aunt's house and changed their lives forever. She said they had prayed for this day. She said it had arrived. Kate Blackburn rests at St. Agnes Cemetery. Joseph Nowakowski is buried at Albany Rural Cemetery, just a few miles away. The woman who swept her porch every Saturday evening without fail, and the man who walked through her door and destroyed her, lying in the same city's ground, separated by a short drive and a lifetime of silence. That silence is over. Nowakowski's DNA is currently being uploaded to cold case databases across the country. A man who carried handcuffs, collected floor plans, and targeted vulnerable women for decades did not stop at one house on Colonie Street. The real question is, how many other phantom files carry his signature? Because if this case proved anything, it is that while the world moves on, the evidence never forgets.